December 14th, 1943, a conference room at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz sits at the head of the table. To his right, Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance. Across from him, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. And beside Turner, Marine General Holland Smith. Three of the finest military minds the United States had produced. Three men who had spent their careers preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Nimitz looks at each of them. Then he asks the question, "Gentlemen, what do you think?" Spruance answers first. "Too dangerous." Turner next. "Reckless." "Outright reckless." Holland Smith agrees. "Take the outer islands first. Watcha, Maluilap. Build your way in. Don't go straight at Kwajalein. Not yet. 3 men. 3 answers. All the same. Now here is the thing you need to understand about Chester Nimitz in that room. 3 weeks before that meeting, he had stood on a beach called Betio. Betio is a tiny island in Tarawa Atoll, 2 miles long, not even a quarter-mile wide. The kind of place you could drive across in 5 minutes. The Marines had taken it on November 20th, 76 hours of fighting, more than 1,000 Americans dead. When Nimitz landed on November 27th, the island had not yet buried all its dead. He walked the length of it anyway. Not a single coconut palm still standing, men with shovels still working in the heat, the smell of something that had no name in polite language. He had been in the Navy for 30 years. Nothing had prepared him for this. Back at Pearl Harbor, the letters were already piling up on his desk. Hundreds of them. The same message over and over from mothers and fathers across every state in the country. "You killed my son on Tarawa." Nimitz read every one and wrote back to everyone. And now, 3 weeks after standing in that smell, he is sitting in a conference room at Pearl Harbor. His 3 best commanders have just told him, "Do not go straight at Kwajalein." And you have to wonder, what does a man like that do next? If you've never heard of the Battle of Kwajalein, that's not your fault. History tends to remember the battles that cost the most. This one was too successful to be famous. If you think this story deserves to be told, hit that like button. It helps more Americans find it. 2 months after that meeting, 36,000 artillery rounds would fall on a single island smaller than most commercial airports. A rear admiral would order a battleship so close to the enemy shore that his sailors could watch individual palm trees explode under 14-inch guns. And on a burning airfield, a 22-year-old Marine with a tattoo on his arm, 4 words, "Death before dishonor," would prove that it wasn't just a tattoo. This is the story of the man who said no to all 3 of his commanders, and because of that, thousands of young Americans came home. The Battle of Tarawa ended on November 23, 1943. 4 days later, Nimitz flew in. The airstrip on Betio had taken fire throughout the battle. The engineers were still patching it. The plane landed anyway. Nimitz stepped out onto an island that was almost unrecognizable as land. Betio before the battle, a flat strip of coral packed with concrete bunkers, coconut palms, Japanese gun emplacements, and nearly 5,000 men. Betio after, nothing standing above chest height, every tree gone, every structure collapsed or burned. The sand itself churned up and black in places from the weight of the bombardment. And beneath all of it, the dead. Nimitz walked the length of the island. He had spent 30 years in the Navy. He had seen the aftermath of battle before. Nothing prepared him for this. The men tasked with burying the dead had been working for 4 days. There were not enough of them. The island was only 2 miles long. There was nowhere to go that was far from the work they still had left to do. He didn't write much about what he saw. Some things resist language. But here is what Nimitz knew, standing on that beach, that no one sitting safely in Washington could fully understand. The men who died here did not die because they weren't brave enough. They died because the tide didn't come in. The assault plan called for 5 feet of water over the reef at H hour. That would have been enough for the Higgins boats, the flat-bottomed landing craft, to clear the coral and reach the beach. But November 20th, 1943, was one of the 2 days each year when a neap tide holds the water down. The reef sat 3 feet beneath the surface, maybe less. The boat scraped to a halt 800 yards from shore. 800 yards. The Marines climbed over the sides and waited. Chest-deep water, then waist-deep, then knee-deep, the entire way under fire. The landing craft that couldn't move, they sat there in the open water, taking Japanese machine gun fire until they sank or burned. 125 amphibious tractors, the tracked vehicles that could actually cross the reef, had been allocated for the assault. By the end of the first day, most of them were gone. The naval bombardment had lasted 3 hours. 3 hours, against bunkers built from coconut logs and reinforced concrete, built to absorb exactly this kind of punishment, built by men who had been fortifying this island for 2 years. The shells had hit. The bunkers hadn't cared. Tarawa was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of planning. And every man who died in that surf knew the difference, even if he couldn't say so. Nimitz came home from Betio and sat down at his desk. The letters were waiting. Hal Lamar, his aide, his gatekeeper, the man who managed everything that came in and out of the Admiral's office, had tried to set them aside. Lamar understood that Nimitz was carrying the entire Pacific War. He understood that the Admiral did not need, on top of everything else, to read letters from grieving mothers. Nimitz disagreed. He read them, everyone, hundreds of them, arriving every day, from small towns in Ohio, from farms in Georgia, from neighborhoods in Boston and Pittsburgh and San Diego, where young men had grown up playing baseball and then gone to the Pacific, and not come back. The letters did not mince words. "You killed my son. My boy is dead because of you." What was it for? Nimitz wrote back to every one of them. No form letter, no template. He sat down and he wrote. He told his wife, "I am just as distressed as can be." He prayed, he actually wrote the word prayed, for the war to end, to stop the killing, to stop the maiming. He visited the hospitals. He walked the wards. He sat beside the beds of men who had lost arms, lost legs, lost things that couldn't be named in a letter home. He stood beside the bed of a 19-year-old soldier who was dying. He told the young man he was proud of him, told him his country was proud of him. The soldier died with a smile on his face. Nimitz walked back out into the corridor, and the next morning he came back to his desk, and he made his decisions. Here is the thing no history book quite captures about what Chester Nimitz was facing. He knew Tarawa was right, not the way it was executed. That was wrong, and he knew it, and he would spend the next 2 months making sure it never happened that way again. But the decision to take Tarawa? That was right. You needed that airfield. You needed that base. You needed Tarawa to get to the Marshalls, and you needed the Marshalls to get to the Marianas, and you needed the Marianas to get B-29s within range of Tokyo. Every link in that chain was necessary. The question, the only question, was this: how do you keep fighting and lose fewer men doing it? How do you take the next island and bring more of them home? That was what Nimitz was working out, sitting at that desk, reading those letters, writing those answers back. Every decision he made from that point forward, every choice about where to strike, when to strike, how to strike, was shaped by what he had seen on Betio, not as a lesson learned in an after-action report, as something he had walked through, felt underfoot, carried home in his uniform. He was going to fix it. The photographs came back in late November. Reconnaissance planes had been running sorties over the Marshall Islands for weeks before the December meeting. High-altitude passes, low-altitude passes, every atoll in the chain, photographed and rephotographed. When the analysts finished their work, The maps went up on the wall at Pearl Harbor. And something unexpected stared back. The outer islands, Voja, Maloelap, Mili, Jaluit, were fortified exactly as expected. Airfields, coastal guns, reinforced defensive positions. Thousands of Japanese troops dug in and waiting. Kwajalein, the central atoll, the Japanese administrative headquarters in the Marshalls, the place they had held since before the war, was lighter, not undefended, not easy, but significantly weaker than what surrounded it. The reason, it turned out, was simple. Japanese commanders in the Marshalls had looked at the American pattern, the cautious, methodical island-hopping approach, and concluded that the United States would do what any sensible military force would do. Work from the outside in. Take the near islands first. Establish air bases. Reduce the risk. Then come for the center. So they had concentrated their strength on the outer ring. They were waiting for exactly the attack they expected, which meant that if Nimitz hit where they were not expecting, straight at the center, skipping the outer islands entirely, he would catch the strongest Japanese position in the Marshalls at its most vulnerable. It was the kind of intelligence that changes everything, or changes nothing, depending on who is reading it. Nimitz's senior planner, Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, looked at those photographs and said, "It's feasible." His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Charles McMorris, agreed. Feasible. Not safe. Not certain. Not without risk. Feasible. That was enough for Nimitz to call the December 14th meeting. He gathered Spruance, Turner, and Holland Smith. He laid out the intelligence. He explained what the photographs showed. And then he did something that was, in its own way, as revealing as anything he would say that day. He went around the room. He asked each man, individually, what he thought. Spruance first. "Raymond, what do you think?" Then Turner. Then Smith. He wanted to hear them out. Every objection. Every concern. Every reason it might go wrong. They did. Spruance laid out the strategic danger. Kwajalein sat deep inside Japanese-controlled waters. Enemy airfields on those outer islands would surround them on every side. Supply lines would be exposed. If something went wrong, if the landing stalled, if the Japanese reinforced faster than expected, there was no fallback position. Turner went further. The plan was dangerous, outright reckless. The outer islands had to be taken first. That was the proper military sequence. The Navy had done it that way for a reason. Holland Smith, who had argued before Tarawa that the whole Gilbert Islands campaign was misconceived, found himself on the same side as Turner. Take Voja and Maloelap first. Build your air cover. Then move on Kwajalein. The three men finished. The room was quiet. No one had said anything Nimitz hadn't already considered. He had been sitting with these objections for 2 weeks, running them against the photographs, running them against the intelligence on Japanese dispositions, running them against every piece of information that had come across his desk since he walked off that airstrip on Betio. He looked around the table. Then he said it quietly. "Well, gentlemen, our next target will be Kwajalein." Most of the men in that room gathered their papers and left. Spruance and Turner stayed. Whatever decorum had governed the formal meeting, it was over now. The two admirals pressed their case directly. This plan was dangerous and reckless. They said those words to his face, the same words Turner had used at the table. Nimitz listened. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who ended arguments with rank. In 30 years of the Navy, the people who had worked closest to him had almost uniformly described him the same way: calm, approachable, genuinely open to being wrong. Rear Admiral Spruance, who knew him as well as anyone, would later say he admired Nimitz's intelligence above all else, and above that, what he called his utter fearlessness. But there is a difference between being open to being wrong and being willing to let someone else's fear make your decision. Nimitz let them finish. Then he said, "If you don't want to do it, I'll find someone who will." That was the end of it. Spruance and Turner walked out of the room. The decision had been made. What no one in that room could know, what no one could possibly know, is that the Japanese commander in the Marshals, Rear Admiral Masashi Kobayashi, had done exactly what Spruance and Turner predicted Nimitz would do. He had read the American pattern. He had moved his best troops and heaviest fortifications to Votya and Maloelap. He was ready for an attack that was not coming. There is something that never quite makes it into official histories about the kind of decision Nimitz made in that room. The histories will tell you he had good intelligence, that the photographs supported the plan, that the logic was sound. All of that is true. What the histories don't say as plainly is this: he didn't know, not for certain, not in the way you can be certain about a math problem or a set of verified facts. He had evidence, he had analysis, he had instinct built from 30 years of understanding how navies fight and how men break under fire. But between the evidence and the certainty, there was a gap. There is always a gap. Nimitz knew it was there. He crossed it anyway, because the alternative, the safe, sensible, methodical alternative that his three best commanders were begging him to take, meant more weeks of bombing outer islands, more weeks of Japanese engineers reinforcing Kwajalein, more weeks of young men crossing oceans toward a target that was getting harder to take with every day. He didn't move. He had read those letters. He was not going to create more of them out of an abundance of caution. On the voyage back from Tarawa, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner sat down at a table somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and started writing. He called the document Recommendations for Changes and Improvements in Tactics, Techniques, Existing Instructions, and Material. It was not a short document. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's own planning officer, Captain James Steele, put together a companion piece. He called his version something more direct. 100 mistakes made on Tarawa. 100. That document became the operating manual for everything that followed. Every man who died on Betio had, in some sense, contributed a line to that list. The tide calculation, written down. The bombardment timeline, written down. The landing craft specifications, written down. The communication failures between ships and shore, written down. The shortage of amphibious tractors, written down. The failure to scout the reef conditions in the final hours, written down. Everything that had gone wrong on November 20th, everything that had put Marines in chest-deep water 800 yards from a beach covered by machine guns, was now on paper, with a proposed fix beside it. By the time the fleet assembled for Kwajalein, 5 specific changes had been made that did not exist at Tarawa. First, the naval bombardment. At Betio, the ships had fired for 3 hours. They had fired from a distance considered safe, far enough back that the big guns could shell the island without putting the ships themselves in immediate danger. The shells had been high-explosive rounds. They had detonated on contact with the surface. Against open positions, open trenches, open ground, they were devastating. Against concrete bunkers, they were noise. For Kwajalein, the bombardment would run for 3 days, not 3 hours, 3 days, and it would use armor-piercing rounds, rounds designed not to explode on the surface, but to drive through it, to punch through reinforced concrete and detonate inside the structure that was supposed to protect the defenders. Second, the landing approach. At Betio, the assault came from the ocean side, the obvious side, the side the Japanese had spent 2 years fortifying. For Kwajalein, every landing would come from the lagoon side. The Japanese had focused their heaviest defenses seaward. The lagoon approach was where the coral reefs were thinnest, the water deepest close to shore, the fortifications weakest. The Japanese had not believed American amphibious vehicles could cross the outer reef and attack from the lagoon. After Tarawa, they knew better, but the fortifications were already built. You can't move concrete gun emplacements in 6 weeks. Third, the preliminary seizure of small islands. Before the main assault on Kwajalein Island and Roy Namur, American forces would land on the smaller islets surrounding the atoll. Carlos, Carter, Cecil, Carlson. Tiny pieces of coral, barely wide enough for a man to stand on in some places, but wide enough to set up artillery. By the night before the main assault, Army howitzers on Carlson Island had registered their guns on Kwajalein Island. Marine artillery on captured islets had zeroed in on Roy Namur. Every major target would be hit from land and sea simultaneously. Fourth, the underwater demolition teams. After Tarawa, Rear Admiral Turner had ordered the formation of 9 underwater demolition teams, what the Navy would eventually call the UDTs. These were the men who swam in ahead of the landing craft. In daylight sometimes, under fire sometimes. They mapped the reef. They marked the channels. They identified and destroyed obstacles. They made sure the men coming in behind them would not find out about a problem by running into it in the dark. Fifth, the landing craft themselves. The LVTs, the amphibious tractors, had been modified, reinforced, redesigned. More of them, better armored, better armed. Enough to carry the first waves across the reef regardless of what the tide was doing on any given morning. 5 changes, none of them genius, all of them bought with the lives of the men who died at Tarawa. But there was one man at Kwajalein who took all 5 of those lessons and added something of his own. Rear Admiral Richard Lansing Connolly. He commanded the Northern Attack Force, the ships and Marines tasked with taking Roy and Namur, the twin islands at the north end of the atoll. Connolly was not a flashy commander. He was not famous. He was not the kind of admiral whose name ended up in newspaper headlines. He was an engineer's mind in an admiral's uniform. And he had a belief, simple, almost blunt, that he had been working toward for most of his career. You cannot destroy a fortified position by lobbing shells at it from a comfortable distance. A shell fired from 2 miles away arrives at an angle. It hits the roof of a bunker, or the side, or the ground in front of it. Some percentage of the time, it does real damage. The rest of the time, it does nothing the defenders can't walk away from. A shell fired from close range arrives nearly flat. It hits the face of the bunker directly. It has enough velocity to drive through the wall, not just rattle it. If you want to destroy a hardened position, really destroy it, not just inconvenience it, you have to get close. This is what Connolly believed. And on the afternoon of February 1st, 1944, he decided to prove it. At 12 minutes past noon, Rear Admiral Connolly sent a signal to the battleship USS Maryland. The signal read, "Desire Maryland move in really close this afternoon for counter-battery and counter-blockhouse fire, using pointer fire for both main and secondary batteries. Move in really close." That phrase, in a Navy that ran on precise technical language, operational codes, standardized communications, stood out like a man speaking plainly in a room full of formal speeches. Move in really close, not advance to coordinates, not reduce range to optimum firing distance, close. Maryland moved, so did Mississippi. USS Mississippi pulled to within 1,500 yards of the Japanese shore. 1,500 yards, a little under a mile. Within easy range of the Japanese coastal defense guns on Roy Namur. Within the effective range of Japanese anti-aircraft artillery, repurposed for shore defense. The Japanese gunners could see the ship. The ship's crew could see the shore. They could watch, through their gun sights, individual coconut palms disintegrate as the 14-inch shells hit them at nearly point-blank range. The bunkers that had survived 2 days of conventional naval bombardment began to come apart. The Japanese defenders who had been sheltering inside them were no longer being rattled by near misses. They were being hit. From that afternoon forward, Richard Connolly had a nickname that would follow him for the rest of the war and the rest of his life. Close-in Connolly. He had put his ships in danger to save his Marines. That is not a complicated calculation, in principle. Every commander understands the trade-off in the abstract. What takes something more than understanding is the willingness to actually do it. To order your own ships into the range of enemy guns because you believe, down to your bones, that the men on the beach are worth more than the risk to your hull. Connolly believed it, and he proved it. The landings began before dawn. January 31st, 1944. Rubber boats in the dark. Army soldiers from the 7th Infantry Division sliding over the sides of their ships and paddling quietly toward 4 small islands at the southern end of the atoll. Carlos, Carter, Cecil, Carlson. Tiny pieces of land. The largest of them not much bigger than a city block. Lightly defended. Most of the Japanese on them were support personnel. Communications men, aviation ground crew, men who had never expected to be in a ground battle. By nightfall, the islands were American. The 145th Field Artillery Battalion had its howitzers on Carlson Island before midnight. Gun crews working by flashlight, registering their weapons on targets across the water. Kwajalein Island, the main Japanese base in the south, was within range. 45 miles to the north, Marines from the 25th Regiment had done the same. 5 more small islands, 5 more artillery platforms. Roy Namur was zeroed in. On the morning of February 1st, the bombardment that had been running for 3 days was joined by everything that had been waiting in reserve. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, land-based artillery from the captured islets, carrier aircraft from Task Force 58. On Kwajalein Island in the south, 7,000 naval rounds fell on the Japanese garrison in a single day. The artillery on Carlson added 29,000 more, 36,000 shells. On an island 2.5 miles long and less than half a mile wide. The Japanese had built their defenses expecting to hold the beaches. They had built their strongest positions facing the ocean, the deep water, the obvious approach. They had not built for this. At the northern end of the atoll, on Roy Island, the Marines went ashore from the lagoon side at 11:45 in the morning. The first wave crossed the reef in their LVTs, then the second wave, then the third. The defenders who came out of the bunkers were not the men who had gone in. 3 days of bombardment, 3 days of Connolly's ships firing from 1,500 yards had done something to the Japanese garrison on Roy that the planners had not quite dared to count on. It had broken them, not their will exactly. The Japanese soldiers who emerged from the shattered concrete were still armed. Some of them still fought, but they came out dazed, disoriented, blinking into the smoke and the light like men who had been underground for a week. The Marines moved across the airfield. At 6 o'clock in the evening, 7 hours after the first wave hit the beach, the 23rd Marines declared Roy secure. 3,500 Japanese defenders, 1 island, 7 hours. At Tarawa, Betio had taken 76. But the story of February 1st on Roy is not just about what the bombardment did. It is about one man who was not supposed to be there at all. Private First Class Richard Beatty Anderson, born June 26, 1921, Tacoma, Washington. He grew up in Agnew, a small community on the Olympic Peninsula, the kind of place where everybody knew your name and the nearest city was an hour away. He graduated from Sequim High School. On July 6, 1942, 7 months after Pearl Harbor, he walked into a recruiting office in Oakland, California, and enlisted in the Marine Corps. He was 21 years old. He joined Company E, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marines, 4th Marine Division. On his arm he had a tattoo. 4 words: death before dishonor. He shipped out for the Central Pacific in January 1944. On the morning of February 1st, 1944, Richard Anderson was a mortar man. His job was in the rear, with his weapon, with his crew, providing indirect fire support for the infantry moving ahead of him. For reasons that no one who was there was ever able to fully explain, Anderson was not with his mortar crew that afternoon. He was at the front, moving across the airfield on Roy Island with the rifle companies, in the middle of a battle, in the middle of a burning airfield, carrying a box of grenades. The airfield on Roy had been cratered by 3 days of naval gunfire, large craters, deep enough that a man could drop into one and disappear from sight. They offered cover. In the middle of the afternoon, Anderson spotted one of those craters ahead of him. He dropped into it. 3 other Marines were already inside. Anderson reached into his box, pulled out a grenade, pulled the pin, stepped up to throw. The grenade slipped. It happened in a fraction of a second. The kind of thing that happens to hands that are tired, or sweating, or shaking, or all 3 in the middle of a battle, in the heat of a Pacific Island afternoon. The grenade fell, down into the bottom of the crater. 4 men inside. No time to pick it up and throw it clear. No time to climb out. No time for anything except the one decision that Richard Anderson made in whatever fragment of a second he had. He threw himself on it. He took the full force of the explosion. He was pulled out of the crater and carried back. Evacuated to the USS Callaway, a transport ship anchored in the lagoon. He died that day. February 1st, 1944. He was 22 years old. He was buried at sea, with full military honors, somewhere in the waters off Roy Namur. The 3 men in that crater with him walked off the island alive. On August 17, 1944, 6 months and 16 days after Richard Anderson died, a ceremony was held at the naval station at Pier 91 in Seattle. His mother, Mrs. Oscar Anderson, stood at the front. She accepted the Medal of Honor on behalf of her son. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Private First Class." Anderson fearlessly chose to sacrifice himself and save his companions by hurling his body upon the grenade and taking the full impact of the explosion. He gallantly gave his life for his country. His mother held the medal. She had raised a boy who had gone to a recruiting office 7 months after his country was attacked, who had tattooed 4 words on his arm, who had ended up, for reasons no one could explain, at the front of a battle on an island most Americans would never hear of, and who, when the moment came, the moment nobody plans for, nobody trains for, the moment that simply arrives, had not hesitated. The following July, a destroyer was launched at the Todd Pacific shipyards in Seattle. On July 7, 1945, a year and 5 months after her son died, Mrs. Oscar Anderson was back at that waterfront, this time to christen the ship that would carry his name. USS Richard B. Anderson, DD 786. She would serve for 30 years. Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War. 3 decades of the Navy carrying the name of a 22-year-old mortar man from Agnew, Washington, into waters his son never got to see. Richard Anderson did not know Chester Nimitz. He did not know that 2 months earlier, an admiral had sat in a conference room and overruled 3 of the finest military commanders in America because he had decided he was not going to waste a single life he could save. He did not know Richard Connolly. He did not know about the battleships that had moved to 1,500 yards so that the bunkers on his airfield would be broken before he set foot on it. He did not know any of it. He was a kid from a small town on the Olympic Peninsula who was in the wrong place at the right moment. But here is what connects them. Nimitz read those letters because he could not look away from what his decisions cost other people. Connolly moved his ships closer because he could not accept a version of success that wasted lives he could have saved. Anderson threw himself on that grenade because he could not let 3 men die if there was anything left in him to stop it. 3 different men. 3 different ranks. 3 different versions of the same refusal to let the people beside them pay a price they could absorb instead. None of them knew the others. All of them were there on February 1st, 1944. The battle for Kwajalein Island itself, the main Japanese base in the south, was harder than Roy. The 7th Infantry Division fought for 4 days, building by building, bunker by bunker. The Japanese garrison did not surrender. They fought until they were dead. It was declared secure on February 4th. When the final accounting was done across the entire atoll, Kwajalein Island in the south, Roinamer in the north, the 30 smaller islets taken in between, the numbers looked like this: Japanese dead, more than 8,000. Japanese captured, a few hundred, most of them Korean laborers who had been brought to the islands by force and had no particular interest in dying for the emperor. Americans killed, 372. 372 men. Across an operation involving 85,000 troops and more than 300 warships, on a target defended by 8,000 Japanese soldiers. Now hold those numbers next to Tarawa. Tarawa, Betio Island, 2 miles long, less than half a mile wide. 4,500 Japanese defenders. Americans killed, more than 1,000. Kwajalein Atoll, 8,000 defenders, more than twice the size. Americans killed, 372, less than a third. The military planners had estimated, based on everything they knew, based on the precedent of Tarawa, based on the density of Japanese fortifications, that Kwajalein would take longer and cost more. They were wrong in the best possible way. Nimitz had expected the operation to take until mid-February. Kwajalein Island fell on February 4th. Roinamer had fallen on February 2nd. He was weeks ahead of schedule. On February 5th, Nimitz flew in. He had done this before, landed on a newly taken island before the engineers had finished clearing it. He walked the ground. In the days that followed, as prisoner interrogations came back, a picture emerged of what was waiting at Eniwetok, the next major atoll in the chain, 400 miles to the northwest. The Japanese garrison there was smaller than expected, the fortifications less developed. The window to hit it before they could be reinforced was open right now. Nimitz did not call another meeting. He did not ask his commanders to form a committee. He called Spruance, the same man who had told him 2 months earlier that going straight to Kwajalein was dangerous and reckless. He told Spruance to take Eniwetok immediately, with the reserves that had not been used at Kwajalein. The operation that had been scheduled for May would happen in February instead, 3 months ahead of schedule. Spruance said yes. He did not argue. He did not say, "You were right, and I was wrong." He didn't have to. He just executed the order. Eniwetok fell by February 21st. When the war ended, when the last signatures were put on the documents on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945, the name Kwajalein didn't appear prominently in the headlines. It didn't appear in most of the headlines at all. Tarawa was famous. Iwo Jima was famous. Peleliu and Guadalcanal and Okinawa, battles that had cost thousands of American lives, were part of the national memory. Kwajalein was not. And in a strange way, that absence tells you everything. History is drawn to the places where the most was lost, where the price was highest, where the photographs were most devastating, where the casualty lists ran longest, where the families back home had the most grief to hold. Kwajalein was won too cleanly to make that kind of history. Kwajalein is the battle that history forgot, because it went right. But the men who did not come home from it, they were not an abstraction. They were somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's father. They were boys from Tacoma and Georgia and Ohio who had grown up in the years between the wars, during the Depression, in a country that was still figuring out what it was and what it owed the world. They had answered a question that none of them had wanted to be asked. And on an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that most Americans cannot place on a map, they had done what was asked of them. There is one more thing worth saying. If your grandfather served in the Pacific, if your father was one of the young men who shipped out from San Diego or San Francisco in the first years after Pearl Harbor, there is a chance he was at Kwajalein, or on a ship in that lagoon, or on one of the escort carriers circling overhead, or on one of the transport ships standing off the atoll while the guns fired and the smoke rose and the men on the beach moved forward. He may never have told you about it. The men of that generation did not, as a rule, tell. Not because there was nothing to say, because some things happened at a level below language, below the kind of words that work at a dinner table or in a living room on a Sunday afternoon with grandchildren in the room. Some things they carried quietly, not as a burden necessarily, just as weight. The ordinary weight of having been somewhere and seen something that changed the way the world looked afterward. There are stories that exist only in the memories of the people who were there. Stories that were never written down, never recorded, never told to anyone except maybe a wife, late at night, or a buddy from the same unit at a reunion years later. Stories that will disappear when the last people who carry them are gone. If you have one of those stories, if you heard something at a dinner table, or in a car on a long drive, or in the last years of someone's life when they finally started to talk, leave it in the comments. Write down what you remember, even if it's only a fragment, even if you don't know all the names or all the places. Write it down, because those men deserve to be remembered by the full weight of what they did, not just by the battles that made the front pages, but by the ones that didn't, by Kwajalein, by the names no headline carried but their families never lost. December 31st, 1941. A Navy launch cuts across Pearl Harbor at first light. Standing in the bow is the man Washington just handed command of the Pacific Fleet, 4 days after the worst naval disaster in American history. The water around him is still black with oil. The USS Arizona sits 27 feet below the surface. The Oklahoma has not been righted. The West Virginia, the California, the Nevada run aground to keep her from blocking the channel. 6 vessels sunk or crippled. More than 2,400 men dead in a single morning. The officers waiting on the dock are not smiling. They know what is left. 3 carriers, a handful of cruisers, a submarine force that has not yet fired a torpedo in anger. Against the Navy that just did this, to a fleet at anchor, on a Sunday morning, with every advantage of surprise. One of the officers present later recalled that the new commander stood at the rail and looked at the wreckage without speaking. He looked for a long time. Then he turned back toward the dock and told his staff to get to work. No headline covered that moment. No photograph exists of it. But what he decided in those first hours at Pearl Harbor would determine the outcome of a war that most of the men on that dock believed was already lost. His name was Chester Nimitz, and the strangest thing about his story is not what he did. It is who understood it, and who did not. In the spring of 1942, inside the Japanese Naval General Staff in Tokyo, an intelligence officer compiled a report on the new American commander. The report was not about ships, not about tonnage or aircraft numbers or carrier doctrine. It was about the man, how he made decisions, what pressures he responded to, whether he could be predicted. Japanese naval officers had studied their American counterparts for years. They knew Halsey, aggressive, emotional, responsive to provocation. They had a theory about what would make him move. Nimitz was harder to read. He had spent 40 years in the Navy without a famous moment, no celebrated battle, no dramatic command. He had run a submarine flotilla, managed fuel logistics, taught at the Naval War College. To anyone looking for the usual signs of ambition, the press attention, the political maneuvering, the public profile, Nimitz offered nothing. The Japanese intelligence report, according to historians who reviewed post-war records, concluded one thing with confidence. This man did not need to be seen winning in order to win. That made him dangerous in a way Halsey was not. Back in Pearl Harbor, Nimitz was doing something no one expected. The harbor was still burning in places. Salvage crews were working around the clock. Casualty lists were still being compiled, and the new commander was asking to go underwater. He wanted to inspect the submarine base personally, not the battleships, not the airfields, not the command facilities. The submarines. He had begun his career in submarines in 1909. He understood them the way other admirals understood carriers, not as a weapon of last resort, but as the instrument that could strangle an empire if used correctly. While Washington was debating what to do about the fleet, Nimitz was already thinking about the supply lines that kept 60 million Japanese fed and armed. He ordered unrestricted submarine warfare within days of taking command. No announcement, no press conference. The order went out. The submarines went to sea. By the end of 1942, American submarines had begun cutting Japan's merchant shipping at a rate that imperial planners had not prepared for. They had built a war plan around a decisive naval battle. No one had told them to worry about the tankers. Nimitz had. But the moment that would define his command came 5 months later, and it came not from a ship or a torpedo or a battle plan. It came from a basement. In a cramped, windowless room beneath the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, a Navy commander named Joseph Rochefort and his team had spent months working against the Japanese naval code, known as JN-25. They worked in shifts. Some of them slept on cots in the building. Rochefort himself went days without going outside, wearing a bathrobe over his uniform and slippers on his feet, moving between tables covered in intercepts and punch card machines and handwritten notations that only his team could read. By late May 1942, Rochefort believed he knew something that could change the war. The Japanese were planning a massive operation. The target was designated in their communications as AF. Rochefort was certain AF was Midway Island, 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. Washington disagreed. The Naval Intelligence Command in Washington, OP-20G, believed the attack was a feint. The real target, they argued, was the American West Coast, possibly California, possibly Alaska. The evidence, they said, did not support Rochefort's conclusion. Nimitz read both assessments. He read them the way he read everything, without visible reaction, according to the officers around him. He asked questions. He reviewed the intercepts himself. He met with Rochefort's intelligence officer, Edwin Layton, who had known Rochefort for years and vouched for his analysis. Then Nimitz made a decision that, if wrong, would leave the west coast of the United States undefended and send 3 of America's last 4 Pacific carriers into an ambush from which they would not return. He sided with the man in the basement. He ordered all 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, which engineers said would need 3 months to repair, to Point Luck, 300 miles northeast of Midway. The Yorktown was repaired in 72 hours. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese fleet appeared off Midway exactly where Rochefort said it would be. By that afternoon, 4 Japanese carriers were burning. Historians have called it the turning point of the Pacific War. The man who made the decision was in Pearl Harbor when it happened. He was not photographed at the moment of victory. He did not issue a statement. He sent a message to the fleet. You who participated in the Battle of Midway today have written a glorious page in our history. Then he went back to work. No one in that building understood yet what had just happened. Not fully. The men who fought it would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain it. The man who made it possible seemed almost uninterested in the explanation. That was not modesty. That was method. And the Japanese, studying the aftermath from Tokyo, understood it before Washington did. 3 months after Midway, the Pacific War looked nothing like a victory. On the island of Guadalcanal, 8,000 United States Marines were dug into a perimeter around a half-finished airstrip that the Japanese had been building when the Americans landed. They called it Henderson Field. The Marines had taken it in the first 2 days. Holding it was something else entirely. Japanese destroyers ran supply convoys down through the Solomon Islands every night, so reliably that the Marines named the route the Tokyo Express. Each morning, more Japanese troops were on the island. Each week, the perimeter shrank a little. The men inside it were eating 2 meals a day when they were lucky. Malaria had reached every unit. The Navy, after losing 4 cruisers in a single night at Savo Island in August, had pulled its surface ships back. The Marines were alone on the island, and the man commanding them, General Alexander Vandegrift, was sending messages to his superiors that were not answered the way he had hoped. The man responsible for the South Pacific was Vice Admiral Robert Gormley. Gormley had not visited Guadalcanal. He ran his command from a transport ship anchored at Noumea, New Caledonia, 600 miles from the fighting. His messages to Pearl Harbor grew darker through September and into October. The situation was, in his own words, critical beyond hope. He recommended that Washington reconsider its commitment to the island. In October, Nimitz flew to Noumea himself. He did not send a message. He did not convene a committee. He flew to Noumea, walked aboard Gormley's ship, and spent a day reviewing every report, every dispatch, every assessment that had come out of the South Pacific Command since August. The officers who were present that day later described the meeting as quiet and thorough. Nimitz asked questions for hours. He did not raise his voice. When he flew back to Pearl Harbor, he had made 2 decisions. The first, Gormley would be replaced. The second, Guadalcanal would not be abandoned. He chose Vice Admiral William Halsey to replace Gormley, not because Halsey was a better strategist, but because Halsey would fight with whatever he had, and fighting with whatever he had was exactly what the situation required. When Halsey received his orders by messenger boat at Noumea Harbor, he read them twice. Then he looked up and said, "Jesus Christ and General Jackson, this is the hottest potato they ever handed me." He took command the same afternoon. What Nimitz did next is less well remembered. He sent no announcement about the change of command. His name did not appear in the newspapers that week. At Pearl Harbor, he continued doing what he had been doing since January, making sure the right people were in the right places with whatever resources he could find for them. When reporters asked about Guadalcanal, he said the Marines were performing magnificently and that he had full confidence in the outcome. He said this when the outcome was not at all certain. Inside his headquarters, the situation maps told a different story. Japanese battleships were shelling Henderson Field at night. 1,000 men had been lost at sea at the Battle of Cape Esperance. The carrier Hornet had been sunk at Santa Cruz. In November, Nimitz received word that the Japanese were sending 2 battleships and a full resupply convoy down the slot toward Guadalcanal. All he had available to intercept them were 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 8 destroyers under Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan. Callahan's force was outgunned in every category. Nimitz sent them anyway. On the night of November 13th, Callahan's ships sailed directly into a Japanese force they could barely see in the darkness between the islands. The battle lasted less than half an hour. Callahan was killed on the bridge of his flagship. 2 American cruisers were sunk, 3 destroyers. Hundreds of men went into the water. But the Japanese battleship Hiei was mortally damaged. The resupply convoy turned back. Henderson Field held. When the final accounting of Guadalcanal came in February 1943, 6 months after the first Marines landed, the newspapers wrote about Halsey. His photograph had appeared on the cover of Time magazine in November. The headline called him the man who saved Guadalcanal. Vandegrift received the Medal of Honor. Nimitz received a promotion to Fleet Admiral, the same rank as Halsey, the same rank as King, and quietly continued running a war that was now, for the first time, moving in one direction. No reporter asked him how Guadalcanal felt. If one had, historians who knew him suggest he would have answered the question briefly, thanked the men who fought it, and changed the subject. He had already moved the maps forward. There were more islands. Vandegrift would later write that throughout the entire Guadalcanal campaign, he never received a message from Pearl Harbor suggesting that withdrawal was an option. He wrote it as a compliment. It was also a description of how Nimitz worked, quietly, without drama, removing the option he had decided not to take. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had shifted. The Japanese were no longer advancing. The Americans were no longer defending. Island by island, the perimeter was collapsing inward toward Tokyo. In June, Nimitz sent 5th Fleet, 350 ships, 900 aircraft, 127,000 men, to take the Mariana Islands. The man commanding it was Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance was, by most accounts, the least visible senior officer in the Pacific. He did not give speeches. He did not cultivate reporters. He walked 10 miles every morning before his staff arrived and was at his desk before anyone else in the building. Nimitz had trusted him with Midway 2 years earlier, when Halsey fell ill and a replacement was needed on short notice. He had trusted him again with every major fleet action since. What happened in June 1944, in the Philippine Sea, would test that trust in a way neither man had anticipated. The Japanese had assembled their largest carrier force since Midway, 9 carriers, 500 aircraft, a plan called AGO, designed, according to post-war analysis, around a specific assumption about the American commander. The assumption was this: Spruance would not leave his landing force undefended to chase a carrier battle. Admiral Ozawa, commanding the Japanese fleet, built his entire operation around that belief. His carriers would strike from beyond American aircraft range, too far for a counterattack, close enough to land planes on Guam afterward, and strike again. It was a plan that required Spruance to behave exactly as Ozawa predicted. On the night of June 18th, Spruance received a message from his carrier commander, Admiral Mitcher, requesting permission to take the fleet west, now, overnight, to be in strike position by dawn. Spruance's chief of staff, Arleigh Burke, one of the finest officers the Navy would ever produce, supported the request. The case was straightforward: move now, hit them first, end the threat. Spruance read the message. Then he refused. His orders were to protect the Saipan landings. He would not leave them unguarded to pursue a carrier battle whose location he could not confirm. He would wait. The Battle of the Philippine Sea lasted 2 days. On the first day, Japanese aircraft attacked in waves. American fighter pilots, directed by radar and flying superior aircraft, destroyed them so completely that the pilots afterward called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 373 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. 3 carriers were sunk, 2 by American submarines, 1 by air attack. By any measure, it was a decisive American victory. It was also, in the view of nearly every senior officer around Spruance, a missed opportunity. Mitcher was furious. Burke later called Spruance's refusal to move west the worst mistake of the war. Admiral John Towers, the deputy commander of the Pacific Fleet, wrote a formal letter to Nimitz demanding that Spruance be relieved of command. The letter was specific. The argument was detailed. Towers had the support of most of naval aviation. Nimitz read it. He did not respond to Towers directly. Instead, a month later, when Admiral King visited Saipan, King pulled Spruance aside. What King said has been confirmed in multiple accounts. "You did a damn fine job. No matter what other people tell you, your decision was correct." Towers never received an answer to his letter. Spruance himself was not certain he had been right. Years after the war, writing to the historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, he put it plainly. "I think that going out after the Japanese and knocking their carriers out would have been much better and more satisfactory than waiting for them to attack us. But we were at the start of a very important amphibious operation, and we could not afford to gamble." He had doubted himself. He had said so in writing. The man who defended him did not doubt him at all, and the Japanese, reviewing the battle afterward, noted something that the Americans arguing about Spruance had missed. Ozawa's plan had been built on the assumption that Spruance would not leave Saipan. He had been right about the man. The plan failed anyway. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not announce itself, that looks from the outside like stubbornness or caution or a failure of nerve. The Japanese had identified it in Nimitz from the beginning. They built a fleet operation around it in Spruance. In both cases, they were right about the man. In both cases, it cost them everything. If this story is landing for you, if something in it feels like it deserves to be heard, a simple like helps it find the people who need to hear it. Not for us, for the men in it. They spent their whole careers making sure no one noticed what they were doing. The least we can do is notice. End of Part 3. Plus C. Tia 1. Running word count, approximately 2,810. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The battleship Missouri sits at anchor, her decks crowded with officers, photographers, and correspondents from every Allied nation. On the table, bolted to the deck in front of the forward turret, a document. 2 pages, 11 signatures required. General Douglas MacArthur stood at the microphone. He spoke for 4 minutes before the first signature was placed. He described what this moment meant to civilization, to freedom, to the generations that would follow. When he finished, the Japanese delegation stepped forward. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed first, removing his top hat, leaning on his cane. He had lost a leg to an assassin's bomb 13 years earlier. Then the generals, then the admirals. MacArthur signed with 6 pens, setting each one aside for the people he intended to give them to. The last pen went to General Jonathan Wainwright, the man he had left behind in the Philippines in 1942, who had spent 3 years in a Japanese prison camp and arrived at the ceremony still visibly thin. Then it was Nimitz's turn. He stepped to the table. He signed with a single pen. He stepped back. No statement, no gesture toward the cameras. A yeoman handed him the pen afterward, and he put it in his pocket. One of the correspondents present wrote that evening that Nimitz signed and withdrew so quickly, it was easy to miss that he had been there at all. In the weeks that followed, the newspapers filled with photographs and accounts and retrospective assessments. MacArthur was named Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan. Halsey gave interviews. Spruance was profiled in several magazines. Nimitz flew back to Pearl Harbor. He had one more task before the formal end of his command. He wrote his final report on the Pacific War, a document running to several hundred pages, assessing every major campaign from December 1941 to August 1945. In it, he named the officers whose decisions he believed had been correct. He named the operations that had succeeded and explained why. He noted the failures without naming individuals responsible for them. He submitted it to the Navy Department. It received no press coverage. There is a photograph taken sometime in late 1945, after the formal ceremonies were done. Nimitz is sitting at a desk at his headquarters. He is in his uniform, reading something. The desk is covered in papers. He's not looking at the camera. The caption in the Navy archives reads simply, "Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz at work." It does not specify what work. It did not need to. From December 31st, 1941 to the last day of the war, he had sat at desks like this one, reading the dispatches, reviewing the assessments, making the decisions that no photographer was present for, while other men stood at microphones and accepted the credit that the decisions had made possible. Historians who have studied the Pacific War closely tend to arrive, eventually, at the same question. Not who won the battles, but who created the conditions in which the battles could be won. The answer to that question is almost always the same name. It is almost never the name on the headlines. After the war, American intelligence officers reviewed the Japanese Naval General Staff's internal assessments of their opponents. The documents had been kept in Tokyo throughout the war, updated as the conflict progressed, revised as the balance of power shifted. The assessments of MacArthur focused on his use of media, his relationship with Washington, his political ambitions. The assessments of Halsey focused on his aggression, his predictability under pressure, the patterns his staff had identified that allowed the Japanese to design the Leyte Gulf trap with confidence that he would take the bait. The assessment of Nimitz was different in kind. According to historians who examined these post-war records, the Japanese analysis of Nimitz returned repeatedly to a single characteristic. He could not be provoked into acting before he was ready. They had tried to read him through his appointments. Every time Nimitz chose a commander, Spruance at Midway, Halsey at Guadalcanal, Spruance again at the Philippine Sea, the Japanese analysts tried to identify the logic so they could plan against it. What they found, instead, was that Nimitz chose differently each time, not from inconsistency, but from precision. He matched the commander to the situation, not to the situation he wished he had. Halsey when speed and aggression were needed, Spruance when patience and protection were required. The Japanese never found a way to plan against that, because there was no pattern to exploit, only judgment, applied differently each time to conditions that were never the same twice. By the time the war ended, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost all 10 of its fleet carriers. Its battleships sunk or permanently disabled. More than 1,000 merchant ships on the ocean floor, cut down by submarines whose campaign Nimitz had ordered in the first week of his command, when the harbor around him was still burning. The decisive naval battle that Japan had planned for since the 1920s, the battle that would break American will in a single afternoon, never came. Nimitz had never given them the conditions for it. Not because he was afraid of the battle, because he understood something the Japanese General Staff, for all their careful analysis, never fully absorbed. The goal was not to win the battle. The goal was to win the war. Those are not always the same thing. And the man who keeps them separate, who can hold the larger objective steady, while the pressure to respond, to attack, to be seen doing something builds from every direction, that man is harder to defeat than any weapon. The Japanese knew this about Chester Nimitz before most Americans did. They spent 4 years learning what it cost them. Chester Nimitz died on the evening of February 20th, 1966. He was 80 years old. He died at his quarters on Yerba Buena Island in San Francisco Bay, the same Navy that had been his home for 60 years, providing the rooms where he spent his last years. His funeral was 4 days later, on February 24th, what would have been his 81st birthday. He was buried at Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. The men buried beside him were not politicians or heads of state. They were the officers he had served with and trusted: Raymond Spruance, Richmond Kelly Turner, Charles Lockwood. They had arranged it while they were still alive, to be together in the ground the way they had been together in the war. No ceremony, no arrangement made for cameras, just the men who had done the work, buried together, the way they had always preferred to operate. Out of the spotlight, getting on with it. If your grandfather served in this war, if your father came home with stories he told at the dinner table and nowhere else, if there is a name in your family that the history books never recorded, leave it in the comments. The name, the branch, the theater, if you know it. Those men did not fight for headlines. They fought so that the people sitting where you are sitting right now would never have to. The least we can do is say their names. Don't let them disappear.
It was just before midnight, March 31st, 1944. Somewhere over the waters east of the Philippines, a Japanese flying boat was losing its fight with a typhoon. Inside that plane sat one of the most powerful admirals in the Imperial Japanese Navy, a man who had spent his entire career climbing to the very top of the most feared fleet in the Pacific. He was clutching a leather briefcase. The plane went down hard. Some men didn't make it out of the water that night. He did, barely, half-conscious, gasping, clinging to whatever wreckage he could find in the dark. And the briefcase? Gone. In the days that followed, this admiral would find himself sitting across a table from American intelligence officers, calm, composed, giving them nothing. He had been trained for exactly this kind of moment, and he was certain, absolutely certain, that whatever those Americans were fishing for, they weren't going to find it. He was wrong, because what was inside that briefcase hadn't sunk to the bottom of the sea. It had already been read. To understand what was in that briefcase and why losing it mattered so much, you have to understand where Japan stood in the spring of 1944. 2 years earlier, Japan had seemed unstoppable. They had swept across the Pacific in a matter of months: the Philippines, Wake Island, Singapore, Burma, island after island, falling like dominoes. But then came Midway, in June of 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the backbone of their naval air power, sunk in a single afternoon. Japan lost not just ships that day. They lost experienced pilots, seasoned crews, and the kind of momentum that, once broken, is very hard to get back. Then Guadalcanal. 6 months of brutal fighting in the jungle and at sea, ending in a Japanese withdrawal in February of 1943. By early 1944, the tide had turned, and everyone on both sides knew it. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur were pushing westward across the Pacific with a strategy that confounded the Japanese at every turn. They called it island hopping. The idea was simple, but ruthless. You don't attack every Japanese stronghold. You pick your targets carefully. Take the ones that matter, cut off the ones that don't, and let the garrisons on bypassed islands wither on the vine. Japan couldn't defend everywhere at once, and they were beginning to realize it. The high command in Tokyo knew they needed something, a line they could hold, a strategy bold enough, comprehensive enough to stop the American advance before it reached the home islands. They called it the absolute national defense sphere, and to defend it, they needed a plan. That plan came from Admiral Mineichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the man who had stepped into the enormous shadow left by the death of the legendary Isoroku Yamamoto. Koga was not Yamamoto, but he was thorough, and he was serious. What he put together was called Operation Z. It was not a single document so much as a complete blueprint for how Japan intended to fight and win the next great naval battle of the war. It laid out where the fleet would be positioned, which island chains would be defended at all costs, how the Navy's air power would be coordinated with ground forces, what Japan would do if the Americans came from the east, what they would do if they came from the south. Every contingency, every fallback, every card Japan still had to play, written down, organized, and stamped with the highest classification in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Only a handful of senior officers were ever allowed to read it. Koga kept one copy. He gave another to his Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, with instructions to keep it secure during their upcoming transfer of headquarters. It was, to put it plainly, the single most sensitive document in the Japanese Pacific Command. And Fukudome put it in a briefcase and carried it onto an airplane in the middle of typhoon season. Now, who was Shigeru Fukudome? He was, by any measure, the product of a system designed to produce men who did not fail. He had graduated from the Imperial Naval Academy at Itajima, the Japanese equivalent of Annapolis, but with a reputation for being even more demanding, more unforgiving, more focused on instilling a particular kind of pride in the men who passed through its gates. Fukudome had risen steadily through the ranks over more than 2 decades. Staff assignments, command postings, the kind of career that doesn't happen by accident. By 1944, he was one of Koga's most trusted officers, and he carried with him the confidence of a man who had spent 30 years being told and believing that the Imperial Japanese Navy was a force no enemy could fully understand, let alone defeat. That confidence would serve him well in a great many situations. In a small room, sitting across from American interrogators, it would become something else entirely. It would become a blindfold. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, there was the storm. By late March of 1944, the situation at Truk had become untenable. Truk Lagoon, once considered Japan's most formidable naval fortress in the Central Pacific, had been hit hard by American carrier aircraft in February. Ships sunk at anchor, planes destroyed on the ground. The base that Tokyo had counted on as an anchor point for the entire Pacific defense was no longer safe. Admiral Koga made the decision to move. Combined Fleet headquarters would relocate south, from Palau to Davao, in the Philippines. On the evening of March 31st, 2 aircraft were prepared for departure. Koga would take one plane. Fukudome would take the other. It was a routine precaution. Senior commanders traveling separately, so that one bad stroke of luck couldn't take out both men at once. No one in Palau that night had a reliable weather report. The forecasting equipment available to Japanese forces in 1944 simply wasn't up to the task of tracking a typhoon moving fast across open water. They flew into the dark, and the dark had a storm waiting in it. What happened next unfolded in 2 very different ways, and the contrast between them is something history has never fully resolved. Koga's plane vanished. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors. The commander-in-chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet simply disappeared into the night sky and was never seen again. For weeks, Tokyo kept his death a secret, telling no one outside the innermost circle of command for fear of what the news might do to morale. It remains, to this day, one of the genuine unsolved mysteries of the Second World War. Fukudome's plane went down differently. It hit the water hard, somewhere off the coast of Cebu. Men were lost. The aircraft was destroyed. But Fukudome survived, pulled from the wreckage by local civilians who had heard the crash and gone out into the storm to look. He was alive. And somewhere in the dark water behind him, or washed up on a stretch of beach he couldn't see, the briefcase had come to rest in someone else's hands. The Philippines in 1944 was occupied territory. Japanese forces had controlled the islands since the spring of 1942, following the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. But occupation is not the same as control. Across the Philippine archipelago, a network of guerrilla fighters had kept the resistance alive, operating in the hills and jungles, maintaining contact with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia through clandestine radio links. These were not amateurs. Many were former soldiers of the Philippine Commonwealth Army, men who had fought at Bataan, who had escaped capture, and who had spent 2 years waiting for the chance to do something that mattered. When the briefcase surfaced near Cebu, it made its way quickly up the chain of command to Colonel Ruperto Canglian, one of the most capable guerrilla commanders in the islands. Canglian understood immediately that what he was holding was not an ordinary set of military papers. He passed it through secure channels to SWPA, Southwest Pacific Area Intelligence, the American command operating out of Australia under General MacArthur. The documents were translated, they were studied, they were understood, and then the Japanese made a move that confirmed just how much those papers were worth. A Japanese naval vessel arrived off the coast of Cebu. The demand was straightforward. Return the documents. Return the prisoner. Canglian and his men said no. Let that sit for a moment. These were Filipino guerrillas, lightly armed, operating in secret, under occupation, staring down a Japanese warship and refusing to hand over what they had found. They knew what a no might cost them. They said it anyway. The documents stayed where they were. Fukudome remained in custody, and the clock, though no one knew it yet, had already begun to run. Fukudome was transferred to American custody within days of his capture. He was not mistreated. He was not broken down. He was simply placed in a room with officers from the Office of Naval Intelligence and asked questions. Here is what Fukudome knew at that moment. He knew he had been in a plane crash. He knew he had been pulled from the water. He knew he was a prisoner of war. And he believed, with complete conviction, that the briefcase he had been carrying was somewhere at the bottom of the sea. That belief was the foundation of everything that followed in that room. He sat down across from his interrogators, carrying the full weight of a career built on the assumption that Japan's secrets were impenetrable. And he gave them nothing. That is not a dramatization. That is what the historical record shows. Fukudome did not cooperate. He did not answer questions about fleet dispositions. He did not discuss defensive strategy. He did not confirm or deny anything of substance. When the Americans asked about Japanese intentions in the Central Pacific, silence. When they pressed him on the Mariana Islands, on carrier deployments, on the chain of command after Koga's disappearance, he gave them the kind of answers that aren't really answers. General, vague, carefully nothing. He had been trained for precisely this, and from where he sat, there was no reason to believe the training wasn't working. The Americans were asking questions, which meant, as far as he could tell, they were still searching, still guessing, still trying to piece together a picture from fragments they didn't fully understand. He was not going to help them finish it. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that they had already finished it, weeks ago, without him. Post-war accounts, not a verbatim transcript, but accounts from those who were there, suggest that at some point during the interrogation, the Americans placed something on the table in front of him, a translated copy of the Z-Plan. His Z-Plan, the document he had been carrying, the document he believed was gone. There are no dramatic words recorded for this moment, no outburst, no confession. What the accounts describe is simpler than that, and in some ways more devastating. He looked at what was on the table, and he understood. Not that he had been broken by a clever interrogator, not that he had slipped up, or said too much, or given something away under pressure. He understood something worse than any of that. He understood that he had lost before he ever sat down in that chair. The briefcase had not gone to the bottom of the sea. The people who pulled him from the water had not been bystanders with no idea what they were holding. The Americans had not been guessing. They had known, from the moment those documents landed on a desk in Australia, exactly what Japan was planning, exactly where Japan intended to make its stand, and exactly how Japan expected the next great battle of the war to unfold. Every careful non-answer he had given in that room had been, in a sense, unnecessary. They hadn't needed him to talk. They had needed him to sit there while they confirmed what they already knew. That is what broke him, not his will, not his composure, but the architecture of the advantage he had counted on. It was gone. Fukudome was eventually returned to Japan in a prisoner exchange. He went home. He resumed his duties. He told almost no one what had happened in that room. But the Zed plan did not go home with him. And 11 weeks after a typhoon brought down his plane, the consequences of that night were about to arrive at full force. By June of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was playing with what remained of its cards, and what remained was still considerable, but only if used exactly right, at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place. The Americans were moving on the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. For Japan, this was not a peripheral concern. The Marianas sat inside what Tokyo had designated the innermost ring of the empire's defense. Lose them, and American B-29 bombers, the largest, longest-range aircraft in the world at that time, would be within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. There was no fallback position beyond the Marianas. This was the line. Japan's naval commanders knew it. They had updated the Z plan into a new operational order called Operation A-Go, after learning that the original documents had been compromised. New name, new details, but the underlying logic, the fundamental shape of how Japan intended to fight this battle, that hadn't changed. Because strategic thinking doesn't reset overnight. You can change the pieces on the board. You cannot so easily change the mind of the man moving them. And the Americans, having read the Zed plan cover to cover, understood that mind very well. The Japanese fleet launched its attack in 4 waves. Nearly 500 aircraft, fighters, torpedo bombers, dive bombers rose from carrier decks and headed east toward the American task force. It was, on paper, an overwhelming force. What the Japanese pilots flew into was not what they expected. The Americans had radar, not just the basic early warning equipment that both sides had been using for years, but a system refined through 2 years of combat experience, operated by men who knew exactly how to read it, supported by a fighter direction network that could put the right planes in the right place faster than anything Japan had developed. The Hellcat, the Navy's frontline fighter in 1944, was a different animal from what Japan had faced earlier in the war. Faster, tougher, better armed, and flown by pilots who had been training while Japanese pilot training had been quietly falling apart, gutted by 2 years of attrition. The first Japanese wave ran into American fighters while still more than 60 miles from the fleet. The second wave fared no better. By the time the third and fourth waves arrived, the pattern was already clear, and there was nothing Japan could do to change it. American pilots, coming back to their carriers that evening, were loose with their words on the radio. One of them called it a turkey shoot. The name stuck. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft were destroyed over those 2 days. 2 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk by American submarines on the same day, going down even as their own aircraft were still in the air above them. It was the end of Japanese carrier aviation as a functional force. They would never fully reconstitute it. Now, a fair question deserves a straight answer. Did the Z Plan cause all of this? Historians have debated that for 80 years, and the honest answer is not directly, not alone. American radar, American pilots, American aircraft, those were the instruments of the destruction. But here is what the Z Plan gave the Americans that no amount of radar could provide. It gave them the architecture of Japanese thinking. Not just where Japan would deploy its ships, but how Japan's commanders expected a battle to unfold, what they would do when the first wave failed, how they would respond when the plan started to unravel. The Americans didn't just know Japan's moves. They understood that Japan had no real contingency when those moves didn't work. A briefcase left a plane. Filipino guerrillas made a choice. An admiral sat in a room and said nothing because he thought there was nothing left to say. 11 weeks, from the night of the crash to the morning of the turkey shoot. That is how long it took for one lost briefcase to help unravel the last great naval air campaign Japan would ever launch. Wars end, and the people who lived through them go on, or they don't. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome went on. He continued to serve through the final year of the war, commanding forces in various theaters as Japan's situation grew darker by the month. He survived the surrender in August of 1945. In the years that followed, he was called to testify at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Allied prosecutors spent years trying to untangle who had ordered what and who had known what, and who bore responsibility for the conduct of the war. Fukudome testified. He was not convicted of war crimes. He lived quietly in post-war Japan until his death in 1971. By most accounts, he never spoke publicly about what had happened in that interrogation room. Some things, apparently, a man keeps to himself. Admiral Koga, the man who designed the Z Plan, the man whose plane vanished the same night Fukudome's went down, was never found. Tokyo awarded him a posthumous promotion to the highest rank in the Imperial Japanese Navy. A formal honor for a man whose fate the sea had never seen fit to explain. And Ruperto Kanglian, the guerrilla commander who had received the briefcase, who had looked a Japanese warship in the eye and said no, he became the Secretary of National Defense of the Philippines after the war. He had earned it. Here is something worth sitting with before we close. Almost every account of the Z Plan affair in American military histories, in naval archives, in the books written by scholars on both sides of the Pacific, tells the story from two directions: Japanese and American, the briefcase, the interrogation, the battle. Kanglian and his guerrillas appear, if they appear at all, as a brief footnote between the crash and the translation, a handoff, a logistical detail. That is not what they were. They were an occupied people living under a military force that had demonstrated repeatedly and without ambiguity what happened to those who resisted. They did not have radar. They did not have carriers. They did not have the full picture of what was in those documents or what it might mean for the war. What they had was the briefcase and a Japanese warship sitting offshore telling them to hand it over, and the understanding that their answer was going to have consequences either way. They chose the harder answer. That choice, made in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map, by men whose names don't appear in most history books, was as consequential as anything that happened in any interrogation room or any admiral's quarters. History has a habit of remembering the people with the biggest ships. It doesn't always do right by the people who made the biggest difference. You don't need a fleet to change a war. Sometimes it's a storm moving faster than the forecasts said it would. A briefcase that didn't sink when it should have. A group of fighters who decided that some things were worth the risk. One piece of information in the right hands, at the right moment, can do what no armada can. That was true in 1944. It is still true today. Before you go, I want to be straight with you about something. The title of this video says the Admiral laughed at his interrogators. I don't know that he laughed. No transcript records it. No first-hand account confirms it. What the record does show is that he didn't cooperate, that he sat in that room, composed and unbothered, certain that the Americans were working without the information they needed. That certainty, that calm, trained confidence, is what the title is reaching for. Whether there was a smile on his face, I honestly cannot tell you. The title also says, "One map broke him." It wasn't one map. It was a full set of operational documents. And broke is a strong word for a man who gave away nothing and went home. What broke, if that's the right word, was the position he thought he held. The sense that he was protecting something that had, in fact, already been lost. That is a real thing that happened. It just happened more quietly than a title can capture in a single line. The real story, a typhoon, a briefcase, and a group of Filipino fighters who refused to stand down, doesn't need much help from me to be remarkable. It already is. Truk Lagoon, January 1944. Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, commander of the Japanese Fourth Fleet, stood at the window of his headquarters building on Dublon Island, looking out over the vast natural anchorage that the Imperial Japanese Navy proudly called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The morning sun was already warm on the water. Dozens of merchant ships and auxiliary vessels rode gently at anchor, their gray hulls reflecting in the calm tropical blue. Oil tankers, cargo ships, repair ships, floating workshops. He had counted them many times before. Today, there were 58 operational vessels scattered across the Great Lagoon, not including the small craft and submarines that came and went with the tides. And beyond the ships, on the 5 airfields carved into the surrounding islands, more than 300 aircraft sat ready. Zeros, Bettys, float planes. Hara had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy for more than 3 decades. He had stood on the bridges of battleships during the Great Fleet Reviews in the Inland Sea. He had commanded forces in the early lightning victories of 1942. He understood what strength looked like. He understood what security felt like. But this place felt different. Truk wasn't just another base. Truk was supposed to be untouchable, a fortress of coral and steel ringed by reefs that made any approach by enemy ships almost impossible, a place where the combined fleet could rest, refuel, and strike anywhere in the South Pacific. A place the Americans would never dare attack. At least, that's what every report from Tokyo had said. His chief of staff, Captain Masataka Kawamura, entered the room quietly, clipboard in hand, the way he always did at this hour. "How many vessels in total now?" Hara asked without turning around. His voice was calm, almost conversational. 58 operational ships as of this morning's count, Admiral," Kawamura replied. "Not including the small craft and submarines still expected this week." Hara nodded slowly. He kept his eyes on the water. A light breeze moved across the lagoon, barely rippling the surface. Somewhere in the distance a seaplane engine coughed to life, then settled into a steady drone. Everything was exactly as it should be. Yet something in the back of his mind had begun to trouble him these past few weeks. The Americans. They were coming closer every month. Not in the old way, with a few carriers and a handful of cruisers. No, something larger was happening out there, beyond the horizon. Intelligence reports spoke of new ships, Essex-class carriers appearing in numbers no one had thought possible. But here, in the warm safety of Truk Lagoon, those reports still felt distant. almost unreal. Hara turned slightly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Any word from Admiral Koga at Palau?" he asked. "Only routine traffic, sir," Kawamura said. "He remains confident that Truk is secure." Hara allowed himself the smallest smile. Of course Koga was confident. Everyone was confident. The officers in Tokyo were confident. The pilots on the airfields were confident. Even the sailors lounging on the decks of the anchored ships down there seemed confident. This was the Gibraltar of the Pacific, after all. Let the Americans come if they dared. They would break themselves on these reefs just as others had broken before. Hara took one last long look across the lagoon. The ships, the aircraft, the calm blue water that stretched for miles in every direction. He didn't know it yet, but in less than 30 days, that calm blue water would disappear beneath American steel and American wings. He didn't know that the peaceful scene before him was about to become one of the most shocking sights any Japanese admiral had ever witnessed in this war. But for now, on this quiet January morning in 1944, Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara simply nodded to his chief of staff and said the same thing he said almost every morning. "Very well, carry on." And the lagoon remained perfectly still. Then came the morning of February 4th, 1944. 2 American Marine Corps PB-4Y-1 Liberators appeared high over the lagoon. They flew so high the Japanese lookouts could barely make them out against the bright sky. But the radio operators heard them. The anti-aircraft crews saw the glint of sunlight on aluminum wings. And within minutes, the message reached Dublon Island. Rear Admiral Hara was in the middle of his usual morning briefing when the telephone rang. He listened without expression as the duty officer read the report aloud. 2 enemy heavy bombers, altitude 30,000 feet, course 090, departing the area. Hara set the receiver down slowly. His chief of staff, Captain Kawamura, waited. "Photo reconnaissance," Hara said quietly. "They're taking pictures. They want to know exactly what we have here." Kawamura nodded. Both men understood what that meant. The Americans had never bothered with high-altitude photos of Truk before, not when they were still fighting their way up through the Solomons. Now they were coming. Later that same day, a longer, more detailed signal arrived from Admiral Minaechi Koga himself. Koga, commander-in-chief of the entire combined fleet, was hundreds of miles away at his temporary headquarters in Palau. His message was short, but it carried the weight of decision. Immediate withdrawal of major fleet units from Truk Lagoon, Musashi, the heavy cruisers, and all operational carriers to proceed west at best speed. 4th Fleet to remain and defend the anchorage with available forces. Hara read the order twice. He handed the paper to Kawamura without a word. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the wall clock. "Sir," Kawamura said at last, "if they are sending reconnaissance planes, they may be planning something larger than a raid." Hara walked to the large wall map and traced a line from the marshals toward Truk with his finger. His voice stayed calm, but there was a new edge in it. "Intelligence section in Tokyo has been tracking their new carriers, Essex class. They say the Americans have launched 7 of them since the beginning of last year. Some reports even speak of 9. Kawamura picked up a fresh clipboard. He had been compiling the latest decrypts all morning. "Latest estimate from Palau, Admiral. Task Force 58 under Mitcher now includes Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Bunker Hill, and at least 4 light carriers, possibly more on the way from Pearl Harbor." Hara stared at the map. He had seen the earlier reports, of course. Everyone had, but numbers on paper had a way of staying small until you spoke them out loud in the same room. 7 fleet carriers, he repeated slowly. In 1943 alone, the Americans laid down more Essex-class hulls than we have built heavy cruisers in the entire war. They are replacing ships faster than we can sink them. He turned away from the map and looked out the window again. The lagoon below still looked peaceful. The merchant ships that had not yet received sailing orders still rode at anchor. But something in the air had changed. Kawamura cleared his throat. Admiral Koga believes the main fleet units will be safer at Palau for now. He suggests we disperse the smaller vessels and prepare the airfields for maximum effort. Hara gave a short nod. He had spent 30 years in the Navy, learning that the best defense was often to strike first. But this time the enemy was not coming with a handful of carriers and a prayer. This time the enemy was coming with an entire new navy built in the time it took Japan to repair one battleship. For the first time in weeks, Hara allowed himself to voice the thought that had been growing in the back of his mind. They are not just building ships, Kawamura. They are manufacturing them. Like automobiles on an assembly line, one slips down the ways, and another is already half finished behind it. He paused. The room felt smaller somehow. And now they have seen us. They know exactly where we are, and how many of us remain. Kawamura stood a little straighter. "Shall I order the remaining tankers to begin dispersal, sir?" "Yes," Hara said, "and double the air patrols. If the Americans are planning to come, they will not come with 2 bombers and a camera. They will come with everything they have." He looked once more at the calm blue water stretching to the horizon. "Tell the staff we will hold a full conference at 1600 hours. I want every officer who can be spared. We must prepare for the possibility that Truk is no longer the safe harbor we once believed it to be." Outside, the tropical sun continued to beat down on the lagoon. The ships below rocked gently at their anchors, but for Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, the quiet January days were officially over. The first cracks had appeared in the armor of the Gibraltar of the Pacific, and the Americans were only 13 days away from turning those cracks into a flood. February 17th, 1944, 5:14 in the morning. The first warning came not from radar. Truk had none working that early, but from a single lookout posted on the eastern reef line. "Enemy aircraft approaching!" The shout cut through the tropical dawn like a knife. Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara was in the operations room on Dublon Island reviewing overnight signals when the telephone rang sharply. He picked it up himself. The voice on the other end was breathless. "Admiral, planes, dozens of them, no, hundreds, coming straight out of the rising sun." Hara didn't hesitate. He snatched his binoculars and strode out onto the concrete observation platform that overlooked the entire lagoon. Captain Kawamura and 3 senior staff officers hurried after him. At first, through the glasses, they saw only a few black specks against the pale pink sky. Small, distant, almost harmless. Hara lowered the binoculars for a second, then raised them again. "Count them," he ordered quietly. The officers began counting aloud. 10, 20, 50. The specks grew. They multiplied. They filled the horizon. 100, 200. By the time the first wave roared overhead, the count had passed 400. Hellcats, hundreds of them. Wings gleaming in the early light, engines screaming as they dove toward the airfields on Dublon and Eton. Hara's mouth tightened. He had never seen anything like it. Not in China, not in the early days of the war, not even in his worst nightmares. "More behind them," Kawamura said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, there are more waves coming." They kept counting. 500, 600. The sky above Truk Lagoon simply disappeared under American wings, wave after wave. fighter sweeps so thick they cast moving shadows across the water. And then Hara saw what lay beyond the plains. On the horizon, faint at first, but growing clearer with every passing minute, sat the American fleet itself. Flat gray silhouettes, dozens of them, carriers, escort carriers, battleships, cruisers. The entire horizon was steel. "Count the carriers," Hara said, his voice flat. Kawamura's hands were shaking as he adjusted his own binoculars. "9, sir. At least 9 fleet carriers. Maybe more behind the smoke." Hara said nothing for a long moment. The only sound was the thunder of American engines and the distant chatter of anti-aircraft guns finally opening up. Too late, too few. He had studied every intelligence summary. He knew the Americans had new ships. But knowing it and seeing 9 carriers appear at once, all at the same time, all launching aircraft in perfect coordination, was something the mind refused to accept. One of the younger staff officers lowered his binoculars and simply stared. "Admiral, the sky is gone." Hara nodded once. The lagoon below, the same lagoon that had seemed so vast and safe only days earlier, was now nothing but a target range. Japanese fighters that managed to get airborne were swatted down almost instantly. Zeros trying to climb were met by Hellcats already at altitude, already turning inside them, already firing. Hara watched one Japanese plane spiral into the water less than a mile from shore, then another, then 3 more in quick succession. "Sir," Kawamura said, forcing himself to stay professional, "our air strength on the islands is less than 100 serviceable aircraft now." Hara didn't answer. He was still counting. Not the Japanese planes. He was counting the American ones. They kept coming, fresh squadrons, fresh waves, as if the Americans had an endless supply of both planes and pilots. For the first time in his long career, Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Helpless awe. Not fear, not panic, just the cold, clear realization that what he was watching was not a raid. It was the future of naval warfare arriving all at once, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had brought a knife to a factory. He lowered his binoculars slowly. The platform around him had gone silent. Every officer was staring at the same impossible scene. Hara spoke only 2 words. "Record everything." Then he turned and walked back inside without another glance. Behind him, the American planes continued their deadly ballet over Truck Lagoon. The sea itself had vanished beneath American steel and American wings, and the Gibraltar of the Pacific was already burning. By 6:30 that morning, the first fighter sweeps had done their work. The Japanese airfields on Dublon and Eton were already smoking ruins. Zeros that had managed to scramble were burning on the runways or floating in pieces on the lagoon. Rear Admiral Hara remained on the observation platform, binoculars pressed to his eyes. What followed next was something no one in the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever seen on this scale. The dive bombers came in. Wave after wave of SBD Dauntlesses peeled off from high altitude, sirens screaming as they plunged straight down toward the anchored ships. Behind them flew the Avengers, heavy with torpedoes and 500-pound bombs. "Target the tankers first," Hara shouted to his signal officer. But the order was pointless. The Americans had already chosen their targets. The first ship to die was the Ikoku Maru, a fast transport converted to carry ammunition. 2 Dauntlesses hit her almost simultaneously amidships. The explosion that followed was so violent it lifted the entire 200-foot hull clear of the water for a split second. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a burning crater in the sea and debris raining down for half a mile. The blast wave rattled windows on Dublon Island itself. Hara lowered his binoculars for a moment and simply stared. One ship, one heartbeat. Gone. Then the tankers began to go. The Shinkoku Maru took 3 hits in the engine room and forward holds. Thick black oil poured into the lagoon and caught fire, turning the calm blue water into a sheet of flame. The Fujisan Maru followed seconds later, her cargo of aviation gasoline erupting in a tower of orange fire that climbed hundreds of feet into the sky. The heat was so intense Hara could feel it on his face even from the ridge above the harbor. "Order all remaining ships to get underway," he told Kawamura. "Any direction, just move." But the lagoon was a trap. Ships trying to raise anchor were met by coordinated attacks. One merchantman got her bow pointed toward the reef channel only to be bracketed by 4 Avengers in perfect formation. Torpedoes slammed home. She rolled over and sank in less than 2 minutes, her crew leaping into water already on fire. Hara watched it all with the detached precision of a man who refused to look away. He had commanded men in battle before. He had seen ships die. But never like this. Never with this terrible mechanical rhythm. The Americans did not rush. They did not waste ammunition. They came in groups of 6 or 8, dropped their loads with clinical accuracy, and climbed away to let the next group take their turn. It was as if they were reading from a checklist. By 9 o'clock the repair ship Akashi was burning from stem to stern. Her workshops, full of spare parts the Japanese Navy desperately needed, lit up the sky like a second sun. Nearby, 3 more cargo vessels disappeared beneath the surface in quick succession, their masts the last things to vanish under the spreading oil fires. Kawamura's voice cracked as he read the latest damage reports. "Admiral, we have lost 11 merchantmen and auxiliaries confirmed sunk. Another 8 heavily damaged and on fire. The oil storage tanks on the eastern shore are also burning." Hara did not reply immediately. He was watching a single American dive bomber pull out of its run after putting a 500-pounder straight down the smokestack of a destroyer escort. The little ship simply disintegrated. "They are not even bothering with our anti-aircraft guns," Hara said quietly. "Look at them. They fly straight and level on their final approach. They know our gunners cannot touch them." It was true. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire was frantic but wildly inaccurate. Tracers floated upward in slow, harmless arcs, while the American planes danced through them untouched. Around 10:30, the pattern changed again. The Americans began working methodically along the western side of the lagoon. They hit the floating dry dock, the water barges, even the small harbor tugs. Nothing was too small. Nothing was spared. One of the younger staff officers beside Hara finally spoke, the thought everyone was thinking. "Sir, it is as if they brought their entire Pacific supply of bombs just for us." Hara gave the smallest nod. He had stopped counting the American planes hours ago. They never seemed to run low on fuel. They never seemed to run low on ordnance. They simply kept coming, wave after wave, as though the carriers on the horizon were infinite. By early afternoon, the lagoon had become a single mass of flame and black smoke. The once clear water was now a thick soup of burning oil, floating wreckage, and the bodies of sailors. The air stank of gasoline and cordite. Hara finally lowered his binoculars. His uniform was damp with sweat, but his voice remained steady. "Send a signal to Admiral Koga at Palau. Tell him truck is under sustained carrier air attack. Tell him we are holding for now." He paused, then added softly, almost to himself, "And tell him the Americans fight with factories, not just with ships." The sun climbed higher, turning the smoke into a choking gray curtain over the entire anchorage. By late afternoon, the first day of the attack was not over. It was only pausing to reload. But Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara already understood something the rest of the Imperial Japanese Navy would not fully accept for months. This was not a battle. This was industrial annihilation delivered from the sky. And the lagoon, that had once been the pride of the South Pacific, was now a graveyard of steel and fire. February 18th, 1944. Dawn. The smoke from the previous day still hung thick over Truk Lagoon like a funeral shroud. Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara had not slept. He stood once more on the observation platform, eyes burning from cordite and exhaustion, watching the surviving ships of his command make their desperate attempt to escape. They had received the order at midnight. Every vessel still capable of moving was to slip out under cover of darkness and run for the open sea. Palau. Anywhere but here. Hara watched them go. A ragged column of destroyers, patrol boats, and a few remaining light cruisers nosed their way toward the reef passages. Their decks were crowded with extra crew and wounded. No flags flew high. No proud signals passed between them. Just silent, determined movement. For a few precious minutes it looked as though some might make it. Then the horizon to the north lit up with muzzle flashes. American battleships. Hara raised his binoculars with hands that no longer trembled. There they were, two massive silhouettes against the gray morning sky, Iowa and New Jersey, the newest, most powerful battleships in the United States Navy. 16-inch guns trained and firing with mechanical precision. The first salvo straddled the light cruiser Katori like a steel hammer. Her thin hull shook as shells the size of small cars exploded along her waterline. Within seconds, she was listing heavily, smoke pouring from every hatch. Her captain tried to turn her toward the reef for grounding, but another salvo caught her amidships, and she simply broke in two. Hara lowered the glasses for a second, then forced himself to look again. Behind the battleships came American cruisers and destroyers. They moved in perfect formation, as though on parade. Their guns never stopped. Shell after shell walked across the water, chasing the fleeing Japanese ships like hunters tracking wounded animals. The destroyer Maikaze tried to fight back. She turned sharply and launched a spread of torpedoes toward the American line. The torpedoes ran true for a moment. Then the American destroyers simply opened fire with their 5-inch guns and cut Maikaze to pieces before her torpedoes could even reach their targets. She burned fiercely for less than 3 minutes before rolling over and disappearing. One by one the others followed. Patrol boats, submarine chasers, even a few armed merchantmen that had somehow survived the first day. They were picked off methodically. No panic firing from the Americans, no wild chases, just cold, calculated destruction at long range. "Submarines," Kawamura reported beside him, voice hoarse. "Multiple contacts outside the lagoon. They are waiting for anything that slips past the surface ships." Hara nodded. Of course there were submarines. The Americans had thought of everything. Air power above, battleships on the horizon, submarines beneath the waves, a 3-layered net with no holes. He watched a small group of Japanese destroyers try to zigzag their way north. For a brief moment they disappeared into a rain squall. Hope flickered in Hara's chest. Then the squall passed, and the American guns found them again. Shell splashes walked down the line until every ship in the group was either burning or sinking. By mid-morning, there was nowhere left to run. The sea around Truk Lagoon had become a killing field. Every escape route was covered. Every direction led to American steel. Hara spoke without taking his eyes from the horizon. "Signal Admiral Koga again. Tell him the surface ships that left during the night have been engaged and largely destroyed by enemy battleships and cruisers. Tell him we no longer control the waters around Truk." He paused, then added the words he had never imagined saying in his entire career. "Advise that continued resistance here serves no further strategic purpose." Kawamura looked at him sharply, but Hara's face remained calm. He was not defeated, he was simply stating fact. The Imperial Japanese Navy had come to Truk with the belief that coral reefs and courage could hold back an enemy. They had learned in 48 hours that factories and coordinated firepower could erase an entire fleet anchorage from existence. In the distance, another Japanese ship erupted in flame as an American shell found her magazine. The explosion was smaller this time. There were fewer ships left to explode. Hara finally lowered his binoculars. The platform was silent except for the distant thunder of American guns. "Record the positions of every sunken vessel," he said quietly. "Mark the wrecks. One day someone may want to know exactly where the Fourth Fleet died." He turned away from the sea. For the first time in 2 days, the observation platform felt empty. Behind him, the American battleships continued their methodical work, their guns flashing in the morning light. The lagoon that had once sheltered the pride of the South Pacific was now a corridor of death with no exit. And Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara understood with absolute clarity that the war had moved beyond courage. It had moved beyond strategy. It had become a question of production, and Japan was losing that battle by the hour. By late afternoon on the 18th, the guns finally fell silent. The American task force turned east and disappeared over the horizon as quickly as it had arrived. No farewell salvo, no victory signal, just the quiet departure of men who had completed their checklist and moved on to the next objective. Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara stood alone on the observation platform for a long time after the last American plane vanished. The air still tasted of oil and smoke. Below him, the lagoon was no longer a harbor. It was a scrapyard. Captain Kawamura approached with the final compiled report. His hands were steady now. There was nothing left to shake for. "Total losses, Admiral," he began. 275 aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond repair. That includes every fighter, every bomber, and every reconnaissance plane based on the atoll. 42 merchant and auxiliary vessels sunk or beached and burning. More than 200,000 tons of shipping gone in 48 hours. All fuel reserves destroyed. All repair facilities unusable. Hara listened without interrupting. He had expected the numbers to be bad. He had not expected them to be absolute. "Truk is finished as a fleet base," Kawamura continued. "We can no longer refuel a destroyer here. We can no longer stage a single bomber squadron. The Gibraltar of the Pacific no longer exists." Hara took the report and folded it once. Then he walked back into the operations room and sat down at the radio table himself. He wrote the message slowly in his own hand. "To Admiral Koga, Combined Fleet. Truk Lagoon neutralized. Request immediate permission to evacuate all remaining personnel and equipment to safer ground. Further defense of this position serves no purpose." He handed the message to the radio officer. "Send it priority, and prepare a copy for Tokyo." The reply from Palau came faster than anyone expected. Koga's staff had been waiting. The message was brief and carried the quiet desperation of a commander who still believed in miracles. "Divert all available aircraft from Rabaul immediately. Re-establish air cover over Truk at all costs. Hold position until reinforcements arrive." Hara read the order twice. Then he handed it to Kawamura with a small, tired smile. "Rabaul," he said. "They want us to wait for planes from Rabaul." Both men knew the truth. Rabaul's air groups had been bled white for months. The few aircraft still flying there were worn out, short on pilots, and even shorter on fuel. Even if every plane left Rabaul tonight, most would never reach Truk. And those that did would find no place to land. Tokyo remained silent. No congratulatory message, no words of encouragement, no new orders, just silence. The same silence that had followed every major defeat since Midway. As if by not speaking the truth might somehow change. Hara walked to the window one last time. The sun was setting behind the smoke. The water below glowed red, not from sunset, but from the last burning oil slicks. Wrecked masts poked up like broken fingers. Lifeboats drifted aimlessly among the debris. A junior staff officer who had kept a private diary throughout the war wrote that night by the light of a single candle, "We have awakened a giant, not just a fleet, but an entire nation that builds ships the way we once built swords. They do not fight with spirit alone. They fight with factories that never sleep. We can die bravely. We can die 1,000 times. But we cannot replace what they replace in a single month." Hara read the entry over the young man's shoulder, but said nothing. He simply placed a hand on the officer's shoulder for a moment, then walked away. Later that evening, he dictated one final signal. Not to Koga, not to Tokyo, to the surviving men scattered across the islands. Destroy all classified documents. Prepare for evacuation. We have done all that honor requires. The rest is now in the hands of those who still believe this war can be won with courage alone. Truk Lagoon, once the most feared anchorage in the South Pacific, had been erased as a strategic asset in 2 days. Not by a superior fleet in a fair fight, not by brilliant tactics. It had been erased by sheer, overwhelming production. And for the first time in the long history of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a senior admiral understood that the war was no longer about who could fight hardest. It was about who could build fastest. And Japan had already lost that race. In the days that followed, Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara found himself alone with thoughts he had never allowed himself to entertain in 30 years of service. He sat in the dim light of a makeshift shelter on Dublon Island, the distant sound of waves the only companion left to him. No more urgent signals, no more frantic briefings, just silence and memory. He had always believed that the Imperial Japanese Navy fought with something the Americans could never match, the spirit of the samurai. Unbreakable will, willingness to die for the Emperor, careful use of every scarce resource, every drop of fuel, every round of ammunition, every pilot trained over years, not months. That was how Japan had won its early victories. That was how a smaller nation had held its own against giants. But Truk had shown him something else. The Americans did not fight with spirit alone. They fought with abundance. They fought as though the very factories of their homeland had been loaded onto their ships and sent across the ocean with them. Where Japan calculated every ton of steel, every barrel of oil, every hour of labor, the Americans simply produced more. They replaced losses before the smoke had even cleared. They built new carriers in the time it took Japan to repair an old destroyer. They trained new pilots while the old ones were still learning how to take off. Hara picked up a single sheet of paper from his desk. It was a summary his intelligence staff had prepared months earlier before the attack. Numbers that had once seemed abstract now burned in his mind like fire. In 1943 alone, American shipyards had launched more fleet carriers than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy had possessed at the start of the war. Not improved versions of old designs, brand new Essex-class ships, each one larger, faster, and carrying more aircraft than anything Japan could build. And while Japan struggled with shortages of rubber, of aluminum, of trained welders, the Americans worked around the clock in factories untouched by war. No blackouts, no rationing that slowed production. Just endless shifts of men and women building the future of naval power as easily as they once built automobiles. He remembered the words of an American prisoner taken earlier in the war. The man had laughed when asked how his country planned to win. "We don't plan to win with courage," the prisoner had said. "We plan to win with factories that never sleep." At the time, Hara had dismissed it as enemy propaganda. Now he understood it was simply the truth. This was not a difference in bravery. Both sides had brave men. This was a difference in philosophy. Japan had entered the war thinking it would be decided by a single great battle, one decisive clash where samurai spirit would overcome material odds. The Americans had entered the war understanding that modern war is won by the nation that can keep fighting longest, the nation that treats war like an industrial process. Build, replace, improve, repeat. Hara stood slowly and walked to the edge of the shelter. The night sky was clear now, stars shining where smoke had once blocked them. He thought of the young officers he had trained, of the pilots who had once believed their Zero fighters were unbeatable, of the sailors who had sung as they sailed into battle. They had all believed the same thing he once believed, that will could conquer matter. Truk had taught them otherwise. The Americans had not come to fight a battle. They had come to demonstrate a new kind of war. A war where the loser was not the side that ran out of courage, but the side that ran out of ships, planes, and fuel first. And Japan, for all its courage, was running out of everything. In private conversations with his remaining staff, Hara began to speak words he never thought he would utter. "We knew they were rich," he told one trusted captain one quiet evening. "We knew they had factories and resources we could only dream of, but knowing it and seeing it are two different things. We asked for a fair fight against their fleet. They brought their entire industrial heartland with them." He paused, then added softly, "And that changes everything." This realization did not break Hara. It humbled him. It humbled every senior officer who had survived those 2 days. For the first time they understood that the war had moved beyond the old rules, beyond the old strategies of decisive battle, beyond the old belief that one great victory could end it all. The Americans were not trying to win one battle. They were trying to win the war of production, and in that war there was no room for samurai poetry or desperate charges. There was only the steady, relentless rhythm of American factories pouring out ships, planes, and ammunition faster than Japan could even count them. Hara folded the intelligence paper and placed it in his pocket. He would keep it as a reminder, not of defeat, but of the new reality. The Imperial Japanese Navy had always prided itself on fighting with the sword. The Americans had arrived with the factory, and in the long run, the factory always wins. That was the lesson of Truk. Not written in blood on the water, but written in steel across an ocean. A lesson every Japanese admiral who lived to see the end of the war would carry with him for the rest of his days. The last American ship disappeared over the horizon on the evening of February 18th. Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara stood on the ridge above Dublon Island one final time. The smoke had thinned to a low haze. The lagoon lay quiet now, almost empty. He gave his last order of the day. "Evacuate all remaining personnel to the Western Islands. Destroy anything that cannot be carried." Then he walked down to the small dock where a battered patrol boat waited. No ceremony, no final salute, just the soft lap of water against the hull and the distant cry of seabirds returning to the reefs. In Tokyo, the news arrived in coded fragments. Admiral Koga read the reports in silence at his headquarters in Palau. He said nothing to his staff. He simply folded the papers and placed them in a drawer. Truk Lagoon, once the greatest forward base in the South Pacific, had been reduced to a scattering of wrecks in 48 hours. Today, more than 80 years later, those same wrecks still rest on the bottom. Divers glide past the broken hulls of the Aikoku Maru and the Fujisan Maru. Coral grows over twisted steel. Schools of fish move through empty engine rooms where Japanese sailors once stood at their posts. The water is calm again, the sky is empty. But for a few brief days in February 1944, Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara and every Japanese officer who looked toward the horizon saw something no man in their Navy had ever seen before. They saw the sky disappear under American wings. They saw the sea disappear under American hulls. They saw an entire fleet anchorage erased not by a superior enemy in a single battle, but by the simple, relentless arrival of ships and planes that kept coming long after any normal nation would have stopped. That was what the Japanese admirals saw when America's massive carrier fleet suddenly appeared over Truk Lagoon. And in that moment they understood the war had already changed forever.